Good morning, party people, and welcome to Seattle. I'm in the Seattle Convention Center for the PASS Summit Conference. For years, this was the biggest SQL Server conference, and then as the database landscape has gradually changed, it became really big for Azure SQL DB, Microsoft Fabric, and now the conference is owned by Redgate, a database tools vendor, and they are broadening it even more. So now it covers things like Postgres, Azure, or Amazon RDS, MongoDB. There's been sessions on all kinds of stuff. I say there's been as it's a past tense. Today is Tuesday, the second day of the conference, where it's still pre-conference sessions. I gave my pre-conference session yesterday, and I was terrified about it. It was the hardest day of the month for me. Like, I plan out everything I'm going to do. And the session was a one-day session that had about 60% new material that I'd never given in public before. So I was really worried about the speed, the pacing of it, whether or not I'd rehearsed the material a lot, but I didn't know whether or not it was going to work well with the crowd there. And it ended up going really well, so I'm really lucky. And now the day is done, and now I get to really enjoy the rest of the month. So today's a day of pre-conference workshops that are not taught by me, thankfully. So I'm going to dip in and out of a few of them and just say hi to people. Eric Darling, Kendra Little are presenting here, Catherine Williamson, Bob Ward, all kinds of folks that you've seen their material online. It's really cool to get to catch up with people in person. You know, I'm a huge fan of in-person conferences. There's an electricity, there's a magnetism at these kinds of events, like a family reunion where you get to see people all the time. I will say that while I was setting up the camera for this session, easily 10 people stopped and said hi. I don't think I made it 60 seconds without having somebody come in and say hi. I wouldn't be surprised if someone interrupted while we were filming this. We're just going to roll with it if they do come up, and I'll say hi and introduce them. But otherwise, hopefully with me talking to a camera, that will slow down some of the interruptions. So let's see, let's go through your top voted questions from PollGab. The top voted question is from MyTeaGotCold, who says, how are you finding DbBeaver for Microsoft SQL Server? I don't use DbBeaver for SQL Server at all. Anytime that I'm querying SQL Server, I use SQL Server Management Studio. It's the most robust tool out there. It's free, it's amazing. I used to hate it and think it was buggy before I started using Postgres tools. And switching over to Postgres tools made me realize how wonderful SQL Server Management Studio is. Sure, every now and then there are those bugs like having problems closing a window that might have possibly open transactions, but overall it's just a phenomenal tool, especially graphical execution plans. I can't say enough good stuff about them. Next up, DBA Mufasa says, we have a SQL Server 2019 Standard Edition that we provisioned with 4 cores. We noticed antivirus is using CPU a lot. We're thinking about adding 4 more cores for the OS, then that'll bring the VM to 8 cores. Can we set CPU affinity to 4 cores so that we stay compliant with Microsoft licensing? So the bad news there is that all the cores that are present in the OS have to be licensed. So that's kind of a bummer. There's a great licensing guide from Microsoft. If you Google for SQL Server 22 licensing guide, it's really clear, it's well written. I can't say enough good stuff about that guide. It's actually really clear. And it helps management in a nice, gentle, guiding way. Say, nope, I know you want to cheat this way, but here's the way you have to do it. So what I would say instead is check out that antivirus software you're using. Maybe it's not a really good fit for SQL servers, and make sure that you set up exclusions so that it's not repeatedly scanning things like the SQL Server files. Next up, SportsFan101 says, do you have a list of DBCC commands that you still use? At a recent job interview, I was asked to name all of the DBCC commands that I know or use. What do you think of this question? These kind of questions like these, I like to call them trivial pursuit questions. That's not my term. I'm sure someone else came up with that. But when someone asks a trivial pursuit question in an interview, the best way to respond is, let me just ask you, is that something that I need to do frequently in this job? Is this DBA going to frequently run DBCC commands? Because I'd be curious. That's not something that I generally have to do during my job. If I have a lot of database corruption, I'd rather find out why that is and solve that permanently instead of having to randomly run DBCC commands during the middle of my workday. Those should be an exception rather than the rule. I can tell you that as a teacher, the only time I use DBCC commands is either free proc cache or DBCC show statistics, and I just do those because I'm an instructor. When I was a database administrator, I was not running DBCC commands on a regular basis, and that's in fact why we even alert you in SP Blitz. SP Blitz will tell you if someone has been running DBCC commands, because that's a problem, and you want to fix that problem. Then hopefully, and a lot of times people ask these questions in interviews just because they don't know what questions to ask. So it can also be helpful to respond and go, look, as a database administrator, I don't usually have to do that. Let me tell you about the kinds of things that I do as a database administrator. And then I'll be glad to elaborate on those if you want. But it sounds like you just Googled DBA interview questions and that was something that came up. And that'll help build the bond there. Next up, VegasDBA says, hi Brent, I have 3 availability groups. I'd like to put a copy of each on another reporting services instance. I inherited hundreds of stored procedures using linked servers for reporting, and it's been an issue with failover and upgrades. When hosts become unavailable or change names, reports all fail. What are your recommendations? Okay, so first off, you don't want to point at a server name. You want to point at an availability group's listener name. Never point at the server name directly, point at the listener name. And that way the listener name is a DNS name that fails over from place to place and follows it along with failovers. If there's no partner available for failover, you have bigger problems because of course your ports are going to fail. If you're not using availability groups and your question's a little bit unclear, it sounds like you're restoring or copying a database somewhere else. If you're not using a listener at all, your best bet is a DNS alias or a DNS CNAME. That's something that you can repoint around to different servers at the times that you do failover. It's not the kind of thing that most DBAs have to mess around with, but if you really want to do that, have a portable server name. DNS CNAMEs are the way to do it. Next up, Vishnu asks, is AWS storage for SQL Server glacially slow like Azure storage for SQL Server? It all comes down to what your budget is. In Azure, you can get fast storage. Most people just don't want to pay for it. And it also requires you knowing something about the VM that you're connecting or that you're using the storage on. Different VMs have different storage throughput. It just so happens that I have a class running SQL Server in the cloud where I teach you how to connect your SQL servers in the cloud to fast storage and what you should look for in that storage. And it just so happens that that class is part of our bundles that are on sale this month for Black Friday. So go check it out at BrentOzar.com. Right on the homepage there are Black Friday deals and they end this month. So make sure to move quickly there. Next up, Bandhu asks, what is your opinion of Elastic Query in Azure SQL DB for cross-server searching? Is it as bad as linked server queries? Yes. Not all the answers are hard. Some of them are easy. Next up, Jökull asks, SQL Server's best practices assessment for Azure VMs shows fragmentation warnings. What is your opinion of best practice suggestions? If you search for Brent Ozar fragmentation, you'll find a bunch of videos that are totally free out on YouTube. I'm never going to answer that question again because it's covered so extensively by me out on YouTube. Google for Brent Ozar fragmentation and you'll find your pick of videos from me explaining all the same thing in lots of different ways. Some of them with whiteboards, some of them with demos, some of them with PowerPoints. So whatever way you like to learn, I'll explain fragmentation to you that way. Next up, Rockwell asks, Rockwell, I could go on a tangent about that name because it's actually really cool. What is your opinion of Azure PostgreSQL? Does it compare favorably with Amazon's offering? I have no idea. One of the things when I started doing Postgres work was I didn't want to get involved in the database administration side of it. And it's not like you choose your cloud based on the quality of one database. You choose your cloud based on a bunch of backroom negotiations between executives. Like they'll make wheeling and dealing, and then they come out of this back room and go, we're going with Azure, or we're going with Google, or we're going with Amazon. And often it has to do with somebody's price negotiations somewhere. So you don't really get a choice when you're negotiating between those. Next up, Bandhu says, what are your pros and cons of ChatGPT versus Copilot? So you're comparing two different things. It's like apples and oranges. It's like saying, what's the difference between a shovel and a pair of scissors? They're totally different tools with different purposes. Copilot calls ChatGPT, but it can also call Gemini or Claude or a bunch of other LLMs. I just got done building a 1-hour session about how database people can use AI, and it'll be a part of my Tuning T-SQL for 2019 and 2022 class that will be part of my mastering bundles, which happen to be on sale this month for Black Friday. Go check that out. Philippe says, hi Brent, I'm wondering what the best platform would be to automate tests, such as unit testing, regression testing, post-deployment testing, and functionality testing. Would T-SQL T be a good choice? Well, when you talk about things like post-deployment testing or functionality testing, those aren't really things that T-SQL T does. It sounds like you want more of a front-end kind of language. So like maybe you're testing that, like after deployments happen, you want to test the quality of the database changes that you made. T-SQL T doesn't do that. Really, there's not a single framework that does everything you're describing there. You're really going to be rolling your own stuff with C# or PowerShell if you want to accomplish that goal. It sounds like you're really ambitious. So what I would say is go to your manager and say, at the end of this year, what are you going to base my raise on? What are going to be the key metrics or key things that I need to accomplish? Because it sounds like you're asking for a whole lot, but you don't have a testing team in place. This kind of thing that you're describing would usually be done by a QA team, not an individual, but an entire team. So that's the thing that I would say is stop and hold on a second, talk to your manager and make sure you're going down the right path there. Next up, Oli the DBA asks, is AWS as frustrating as Azure? It constantly feels like one step forward, 2 steps back. I find this nonstop relating to performance and architectural designs. If I need more perf, turn the dial, but now your HA is gone. Sigh. It sounds like you didn't read the documentation. It sounds like you're fumbling around like a teenager in the back seat of a car trying to figure out how to get somebody's bra undone. And it sounds like you're groping around and you're having unpleasant surprises. Oops, wrong hole. I'd say you're probably not spending enough time reading the documentation. If you constantly find yourself being surprised like that, it's probably time to read before you do. And I know those of us who've been working in technology for many years tend to have this thing with overconfidence. I'll figure it out. It can't be that hard. It is that hard. Next up, Hakan asks, do you know of a course that would work for in-house certification for basic querying skills for data warehouse purposes? Yes, LeetCode. Check out LeetCode, L-E-E-T code. I can't remember if it's L33T code. It might be L33T code. But they have all kinds of exams that you can use, and they're used by hiring companies, like Coca-Cola, General Motors, in order to show that you have knowledge in certain topics. But you can also use it for in-house teams as well. I don't know anything about the pricing or availability or whatever. I just know I have a lot of clients who use it. Chomping Bits says, this was an entirely academic question, but I was curious if the order of the on clause in an inner join matters. I wouldn't think it makes any difference, but I was curious. So your best bet with things like that is to run experiments, right? Is go run them and then compare the execution plans. See if there's any difference inside the execution plans. Whenever you have a question that you find either hard to Google or you don't find good information on Google about, and it's so easy that you could run the experiment in a matter of seconds, then you should run the experiment. It's one of my favorite things that Paul Randall ever taught me when I was working alongside Paul Randall was, he said, if you can run the experiment faster than you could write the question to someone else, then you owe it to yourself to run the experiment, to honor their time. It's not that you're not honoring my time. It's actually a really good question, but I want to encourage you to run that experiment because it is so easy. You're wasting my time. That's not true. That's not true. I'm joking there. That was just fun to say. Nam next up says, have you seen an Azure database or managed instance that was about to exceed the maximum storage space allowed by Azure? Yes. How would you go about resolving instances where the cloud storage limits are going to be exceeded sooner or later? Very simple, SP blitz index, sort order equals size, mode equals 2, get all databases equals 1. I teach you this in my totally free How I Use the First Responder Kit class. That's one of the few classes that is not on sale during my Black Friday sales because it's free. Look, I can't make it any cheaper than free. You gotta watch the class, How I Use the First Responder Kit. Totally free. I teach you how to sort your objects by size inside there. And I even cover this scenario inside this class. I constantly run that with clients and then say, hey, tell me what these largest tables or largest indexes are here for. And over, clients go, oh my gosh, I didn't realize we still had that copy of sales from 2013 still in the database. Oh my gosh, I had no idea that we had 4 indexes on this giant column that are never getting used. And so that's free, easy to drop off, low-hanging fruit that then buys you enough time that you can either peel certain parts of the database out to other platforms, like for example, maybe you're putting session state in the database and that belongs somewhere else, or you start to think about peeling off stuff into other databases like archives. Next up, Crazy Harry says, what's your recommended way to periodically export data out of Redshift and into Azure SQL VMs? I don't do any ETL work at all. I also don't work with Redshift at all. Your best bet there would be to talk to a Redshift person. JT says, I've been a SQL DBA for 9 years now, congratulations, and have not used AI tools at all professionally or personally. In a previous episode, you mentioned that the money in AI is well spent. What's one example of how you use the tools? I'll give you a great example that happened from last week. Last week, I was working with a client to performance tune a stored procedure. And I opened the stored procedure and I'm like, nested cursors, oh my God. It was one nested cursor inside of another, and it was making updates and inserts row by row inside each one of these. And I was like, let's just try something. Let's copy paste this stored procedure into ChatGPT and let's ask it to rewrite the query in a set-based operation instead of using nested cursors. And within 30 seconds, I had my answer. That saved me hours of manual labor. It would have been such a crappy job, something that I don't enjoy at all. And was the query perfect when it came out? No, but it was very easy to make the necessary tweaks, and that just saved me so much time. So hopefully that gives you an example there. The other way that I use it is I will literally leave it open on my desktop all day as a prompt to myself that when I'm doing something, I should go ask ChatGPT to do it for me first. Sometimes it actually does the whole task and I don't have to lift a finger. Other times it gives me an interesting second opinion on a way that I could do the thing. Next up, Ricardo asks, I need to improve a function that is already fast. It's going 7,350 executions a minute. What's the best approach to go from a blink to half a blink? So it's hard for me to say without looking at the function. You know, it's obviously it's like how do I tune a query? I need to see the query. Is it possible to do that kind of thing? Absolutely. But the first thing that I'd step back and ask is, where are you calling it from? 7,000 times a minute is, my math is pretty bad, but 100 times a second. I would want to know what we're calling that for. Very often, it's a caching issue. It's something that shouldn't be called and repeatedly regenerated at all. I'm not saying that that is in your case, but again, that's why you have to show someone the code when you ask them how to tune it. Next up, SQL Fumbler says, a developer asked if I can extend the error message column in the error logs. Deadlock entries only show 300 characters. Is this possible? No, but there are trace flags that you can use to get yourself more information on deadlocks. I find it sad in my career that I know those two trace flags, 1204 and 1222. So if you Google for SQL Server trace flags, and I'm 90% sure they're right, I'm not 100% sure, but Google SQL Server trace flags 1204 and 1222. They'll show you what information goes into the error log. Now, frankly though, I don't use those. It's been 10, 15 years since I've used them because I use the phenomenal SP Blitzlock written by Eric Darling, maestro of T-SQL. SP Blitzlock, you don't need to turn any trace flags on. It just gets you the information out of the default trace. Go check that out. It is rather expensive. No, wait, I got that wrong. It's free. Go check out SP Blitzlock. It's in our first responder kit. Next up, Renzi asks, do you have any helpful scripts or tools to find permissions in SQL for Active Directory users that no longer exist? Who cares? No, seriously, like who cares? If permissions were granted to a user and that user no longer exists, who cares? I don't care. There we go. Ricardo has another question. Ricardo says, hi Brent, I was going to ask about my nervousness around changing hundreds of untrusted foreign keys. But then, as I was typing, my Brent-in-my-head piped up with just go test it in a test system first and discuss it with the team first. Thanks again, Brent. Yeah, you know, it's really funny. I hear over and over again from people after they've been watching for office hours, they start to ask themselves, wait a minute, what's the problem that I'm trying to solve? Just since I ask that question so often on office hours, what's the problem you're trying to solve? You know, come back to that. I hear from people that they start asking themselves that, and it really helps them with when they're struggling on a problem, and they go, wait a minute, I'm trying to solve the wrong problem entirely. So I'm glad that got to help you there. Next up, let's see here. Steve says, hi Brent, what are the reasons that would cause long plan compilation times? Oh, sure. The more complex your database structure is and the more complex your query is, the longer compilation takes. So for example, the more tables that you try to join, the more indexes that are on those tables, the more partitions that are on those tables, then the more longer plan compilation takes. And that really is that simple. The more complex the database and the more complex your query, the longer compilation will take. End of story. Q-Ent asks, hi Brent, I was wondering how you maintain and monitor all the links that you use like brentozar.com/go. There's a free WordPress plugin called Redirection. If you go into the WordPress plugin gallery, search for Redirection, totally free. And we'll do one more. Gary says, are you going to the PASS Summit? Well, obviously, I suppose that answer is yes. Anytime that I have the opportunity and it works out with my schedule, I love coming here because it really is like a family reunion. Isn't it nice that no one, I say nice, no one actually interrupted us. There were twice while we were filming that I saw someone kind of timidly come up out of the corner of my eye, look, saw that I was talking to the camera, and then kept walking. I was like, oh, okay, that's good. But I always try to come here if it works out for my schedule. I missed last year because it was the same week as the Formula One races in Las Vegas, and I really wanted to see F1 in Vegas. I got lucky with timing this year. It's also really tricky because it's always, my birthday is in November, the F1 races are in November, past Summit's in November, so scheduling is always a little tricky. Eve's, we do, like all kinds of stuff happens in November. Some of our best friends' birthdays are in November. But this year it worked out really well. I think they announced the schedule, I'm sure they did, for 2025 already. And so I've got it in my calendar. I don't know if I'll be here. It'll depend on whether or not the Formula One races are in Las Vegas again next year. I mean, or conflict with the dates. Because it's amazing to see. I don't go to the race itself. I go to practice days for F1 because it's really cheap. It's like $60, $70. And you get to hear the incredible noises of the F1 cars racing around. And the city's beautiful at night. It's spectacular. So that sadly that takes precedence over my career. But otherwise I love coming here just for the family reunion version of it. So it is about 15 minutes before today's pre-conference classes start, so I'm going to go pack up my camera and go stick my head in. Eric and Kendra said I could sit in the back of their session and watch, and they promised they'll hardly ever call on me, so that could be kind of fun. And also Grant, Fritchie, and Ryan Booz are doing a Postgres pre-conference class, and I kind of want to stick my head in there to see like what topics they teach. Part of the fun of doing classes, of conducting classes, is trying to figure out what you're going to teach given the time that you have. Like, how are you going to prioritize the material? How much time do you spend on each topic? And because I like both Grant and Ryan, and I like Eric and Kendra too, because they're great fun presenters to watch. Generally speaking, the pre-conference presenters that you see here at the past summit are generally at the top of their game, because this is like the premier US SQL Server Microsoft Database Stack conference. The competition for pre-cons tends to be pretty cutthroat. Everyone wants to sell a pre-con because you get paid to do it. You get, this year it was $200 a person, and I had about 150 people in my pre-con, so I made about $30,000. It's kind of deceiving because it sounds like you make 30 grand in one day. That's not entirely true because you have to write the material, you have to promote your pre-con, all that kind of stuff. Because there's so much money at stake, the competition tends to be cutthroat, and there tends to be really good, top quality materials here. So as a presenter, I love seeing those other people at work and their different styles, and it's inspirational to me. So hope to see you around this week at the past summit, and catch you on the next office hours. Adios.